Well, as you know, we're going through some of the segments that that were part of our Believe in Our City event here recently. And this segment is with Evan Feinberg and Daron Babcock, and our friends from Stand Together, who really have been incredibly helpful for me as I've worked with that organization, understanding these principles of human progress, understanding these ways of applying market ideas to civic challenges or community challenges, social issues that we face. And really the whole emphasis behind it was this empowerment paradigm, this idea that we believe in people, and people within themselves have the capacity and the capability to achieve their goals, to achieve their potential. And so it's a great conversation as Evan kind of lays that out, and Daron and he have a great conversation about these topics. I continue to learn more every time I hear from them. Enjoyed their presentation, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it too.
We believe, and have always believed, in this country that man was created in the image of God, that he was given talents and responsibilities and was instructed to use them to make this world a better place in which to live. And you see, this is the really great thing of America.
It's time to discover what binds us together, and finding it has the power to transform our world. That's what I believe. How about you?
I wanted to go ahead and connect the dots between what we talked about last night, talking about the American idea and what that means to believe in our city. I'm not from Grand Rapids. I'm from the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area and live in Washington, D.C. But I've had this incredible opportunity to see up close what you're doing here, and I think it is really inspiring because you are, in fact, living the American idea. So to connect the dots, I wanted to tell the story of someone who I think is one of the most important cultural commentators on the American idea in American history. And it's a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville. He came to America in the early 19th century, in the 1830s, and he was studying what was going on in America that made it so dynamic. Of course, he wrote about the areas where we were falling short as well, but he wanted to understand that dynamism that Doug was talking about. You know, railroads were being built, commerce was growing, trade was growing, something exciting was happening in the United States of America. And de Tocqueville was coming over from France. And his entire paradigm of the world were paradigms of power. The way they solved problems were, as he put it, wealthy aristocrats, politicians, kings, people with power and control, and people would look to them to solve problems. So he travels to America, and he's like, okay, well, they must have just phenomenal leaders and landowners here in the United States of America. So he goes to Washington, D.C. He's looking for those brilliant people, and he finds that there is nothing going on. The D.C. area was quiet. It was sleepy. Nothing impressive was happening there. So he says, okay, well, it must be the state governments, right? There's a lot of state power in the United States. So he goes out to all those states, and he finds the same thing there. It's sleepy. Nothing exciting's happening. These people don't really have any real power. And then he goes out into our communities. He goes out into our civil society, and that's where he finds the magic of the American idea. He finds people helping people, neighbors helping neighbors, people constantly being empowered to tap into their unique gifts and talents to contribute in the lives of others. And he sees an entirely different paradigm from that paradigm of power. He sees the American idea lived out in communities with one another. He writes that when Americans see problems of any kind, they seek each other out. And when they do, they unite. And when they do, they become a power that one sees from afar, a power that speaks and to which one listens. What Tocqueville saw that was so special about America was the idea that we were constantly coming together in common cause, not looking for powerful people to solve our problems, but asking what we could do to solve the problems that we saw not only in our own lives, but in the lives of others. This was the American idea lived out. He wasn't looking for just how we ordered our government and just the Constitution's restrictions on power. He was looking how people use those ideas to flourish. And I think this has so much to share with us today, because what I learned, we talked a lot last night about the problems that are facing Grand Rapids And frankly, those problems are facing our country. There are 40 million Americans experiencing poverty today. Economic and social mobility are on the decline. Loneliness and despair are at record levels. We have a mental health crisis, an addiction crisis, with 20 million Americans experiencing addiction in our country today. We're losing loved ones each and every day. We've got problems that feel like they're reaching a fever pitch with the toxicity and division that we see all around us. But when we're looking for solutions to those problems, the answers are within this room. They're with the leaders that are here, right? So we talked a lot about what might divide our country last night, but there is so much more that unites us in common cause. I know for a fact that every single person here was invited, and then you accepted that invite because you believe in this city. You believe in the people that are part of it. You are what Tocqueville saw, the people that aren't pointing fingers at one another and looking for who to blame for the problems. But you're asking, what can we do in common cause to unite and empower each and every person in our community to realize their full potential? That is, when I was asked to talk about the empowerment paradigm, that is the empowerment paradigm rather than paradigms of power and control. So when we think about how we might apply that, I'll tell you the story of my good friend Scott Strode. So Scott Strode is a wonderful leader. He is in active recovery from addiction. He hit rock bottom a couple decades ago. But Scott found sobriety through believing in himself again by climbing mountains with friends, riding bikes with friends, and being at a boxing gym with friends. And together they recovered from their addiction, each of them individually. One thing led to another, and Scott said, well, gee, if this recovery worked for me, maybe it can work for a whole lot more people. So Scott started an organization called the Phoenix. He put on a sober shirt to be proud in his recovery, and he showed up at coffee shops and handed out flyers to see if anyone else would come join him, ride bikes together, and share their sobriety with one another. That effort turned into a nonprofit. They started opening up CrossFit gyms. They grew to 2 or 3 states. Soon it was a few thousand people. And now today there are over 400,000 members of the Phoenix, which is an addiction recovery movement that's scaling up all over the country, relationship by relationship, person by person. It's an incredible effort. It's no longer just a nonprofit organization. It's a recovery movement that's sweeping across the country. And I tell you about the Phoenix because I think it's driving some pretty profound change. You know, I have a family member who struggled mightily with addiction, and he's never set foot inside a Phoenix gym or a Phoenix bike ride or met anyone from the Phoenix. And yet it's changed his life because now that they've reached 400,000 members, the ideas of the Phoenix have begun to scale. The ideas of resilience and believing in people and taking a strengths-based approach to these efforts is now something that my wife and I and our family can take from the Phoenix and apply independently of that organization. It's what Tocqueville saw, this dynamic problem solving in America, and then it becomes this thing that spreads like wildfire. So I tell you the story of the Phoenix because I want you to take a couple of important lessons about how social change happens. And from there, I'll share with you, and I'm shamelessly stealing this from Andy Crouch, a wonderful commentator who talks about these ideas. He talks about how social impact happens. So that's why we're all here, right? We want to drive social impact. He says, the definition of social impact is often thought about like the physics definition of impact. The word impact has a physics definition. It's force over time, right? Force divided by time. So if I put my hands out like this and I swing them together real hard over a short amount of time, lots of impact, right? But if I take them very slowly, right, over a long period of time and without much force, there's very little impact. And everyone's been thinking about social impact as if it's a physics problem. And so they're going to methods of power and control to try to drive it faster, right, in less time, and a whole lot more impact. And given the size of our problems, you'd think we need to do that. We need to go as big and as fast and as hard to the hoop on this as we can, because too many Americans are left behind and too many people are facing barriers to realizing their full potential. But here's the problem. Unlike the success that Scott Strode's effort at the Phoenix has, that approach to social change has never worked. And it's not working. It's actually what brings us here today. You know, across the country, the government is fighting a war on poverty, spends over $1 trillion per year to solve these problems. And they're getting worse. Private philanthropy, hundreds of billions of dollars more all across the country to solve these problems. And they're getting worse. So something that we're doing, seeking out of all of the best intentions to will ourselves to victory through power and control, isn't working. So Andy talks about a different approach, and I'll finish with his definition here in a second. But before I get there, it's how do we think about what is big enough? Because it's not that we need a smaller solution than going hard at these problems. We need a bigger solution. The only thing big enough to solve the huge problems facing our country is to lean further into that American idea of empowerment. What Tocqueville saw that was working about our country. Person to person, neighbor to neighbor, solving these problems. So you take a problem as big as chronic homelessness in our country. There are about 148,000 Americans right now that are sleeping on the streets that are chronically homeless. You see the problem on the news all the time. But you think about that problem, 148,000 chronically homeless, but there are 400,000 faith communities in our country. If every single faith community were to help one person to get off the streets, to tap into their gifts and talents and contribute in society again, we'd have solved the problem 2.5 times over. We could do the same exercise for so many more. There's just over 1 million people that are chronically jobless, and there are 33 million businesses in America, right? Over and over again, we see as people face significant barriers, the assets are there always and everywhere in our communities to solve these problems. And then you take it one step further. My friend Todd Rose from a think tank called Populous has done research and says, how do you define living the American dream? What's success for you? And to a T, across every demographic, every ideology, almost everyone in their top 5 says making a positive impact on my community is living the American dream and living a successful life. And then you ask, of the 65 things that people list as living a successful life, what are they least likely to be achieving? Near dead last is making a positive impact on my community. So you see, the empowerment paradigm is about connecting the dots between the only thing that is complex enough and big enough to solve the complexities of the problems facing our communities, our relationships. At Stand Together, we often say relationships outcompete programs and services every day of the week and twice on Sunday. So if we're going to unleash these relationships, it's a new formula. Andy Crouch, again, since I took this idea from him, he defines it as, instead of impact, we need influence. Instead of force, we need friendship. And T can still be time, but instead of dividing force by time, we exponentially increase friendship over time. It's friendship to the T power, I equals F to the T power. It's this idea that the only thing that's ever changed the world are people connecting with people. One of my favorite quotes is one from Margaret Mead. I learned it from The West Wing. I was a big West Wing fan growing up. I've watched it through a few times. And President Bartlett turns to his staff and says, "Why do I believe that a small group of dedicated individuals can change the world?" Does anybody know what the answer is? It's because it's the only thing that ever has. Person to person, belly to belly, elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder, serving together, empowering people. It's contagious and can drive meaningful change compounded over time. It's what happened With Scott Strode and the Phoenix, a guy and a bike, a handful more people riding bikes together. Now a recovery movement that can change the way the entire country tackles addiction. This is the way social change happens. So my challenge for you is this, as you think about an empowerment paradigm versus control, as you think about living up to America's lofty ideals. Doug last night pointed out the people we had in this room to drive change. We've got the mayor, we've got commissioners, we've got educational leaders, we've got nonprofit leaders, we've got titans of industry in business, right? And the temptation will be to think about, well, those individuals have the authority to drive change. Those individuals have the ability to do something with their power to drive change. And that is probably every single one of you in this room. But I challenge you not to think about the opportunity to use authority to drive this change, but instead to think about the breadth of relationships that are represented in this room. Imagine what can happen if you lead the way on empowering more people to realize their full potential, and you unlock every door and you remove any barrier you can to getting as many people in the city of Grand Rapids to see and serve their neighbors, to see them for their potential, and help them to realize it in their life. That's the opportunity that's before us to live the empowerment paradigm. Now, the word paradigm is kind of a funny one, right? What does it mean? A paradigm, a lens by viewing the world, a worldview. It is important that there are a certain set of principles, as Doug mentioned, that over time have proven to empower people and to drive progress. And I'd encourage you to think about those founding values, but apply them not just to the role of government, but to apply them in your own life as well, the way the founders were, as Jeff shared last night around their virtues. And I want to call out a handful that I think will really help us to be effective in driving social change. The first is dignity. The Declaration of Independence is based on this idea of human dignity, that all people are created equal. And made, the founders talking with language, people are made in the image of God, whether it was nature or nature's God, that they have certain unalienable rights that are theirs by nature of being human. But these ideas go further. This idea of dignity is that each and every person has a gift and value to contribute. I'll tell you, I've been doing social change work like this for a number of years now, and the most shocking thing to me about it is how many people would say they agree with that, but the approach that they take does not believe that the individuals they're serving and supporting, they don't even believe that they're capable of transformation. They treat them as broken and deficient, as the problem to solve or problems to be managed, rather than people capable of extraordinary things. So I'd suggest the first thing we need to do is radically live the principle of human dignity. The second is mutual benefit. There's this idea, this pernicious idea out there that the world is a zero-sum game, that for some to win, others have to lose. This idea will destroy any social change effort. The world is and must be one of mutual benefit, where I only gain and succeed by helping others to succeed. And that when they succeed and contribute and create value, they create more value in the world, and therefore we all benefit. So Doug's hit this point a number of times. Mutual benefit drives abundance. But zero-sum thinking, us versus them, it tears us apart. Leads to another principle, one of openness. This is another physics term for you, right? The second law of thermodynamics. Closed systems tend toward entropy, but open systems flourish. So how do we as people, how do we as a community take a posture of openness and humility and discovery, finding new and better ways? I'll tell you, the idea in the social sector that we already know the answers and we just need to faithfully execute the evidence-based best practices, there's no indication that we have any idea of what we're doing. There's hundreds of studies out there. We've reviewed thousands of nonprofit efficacy studies, and of the publicly available studies we can find, we found less than 2% show any statistically significant, meaningful, positive results as a result of their work. We need to learn what works. We need to discover what works. And that means we need a posture of openness rather than being closed, right? And that means working together in common cause and uniting to do right as well. And then finally, one last principle to think of, it's that bottom up works a whole lot better than top down. So just as we need to be open to discovering, those closest to the problem usually know better how to solve it than those from the outside looking in. Those that have experienced the problem are often the best social entrepreneurs. Scott Strode knew a whole lot about addiction recovery and what works because he lived it. And in your communities, each and every day, there are so many people closer to the problem, either because they themselves have experienced it or they themselves have gotten proximate enough to it to learn things that will help them to discover things that might work and try and iterate. We need a whole lot more social entrepreneurship and a whole lot less planning in our work to transform communities. So look, these are the principles that I would define as the principles of human progress that Doug mentioned. They're the principles that drive human empowerment across time. But when I come to this group, I am so encouraged. Because one of my favorite quotes that I like to use all the time, and I can't do the impersonation very well, but Bill Clinton, would put out his thumb like this, and he would say, "There is nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what is right with America." The empowerment paradigm is that this is a room full of people that are doing the things that are right about America, and there is no problem that we're working on that this group can't solve together by applying these principles and empowering people from the bottom up. So I know this is a pretty abstract concept, so I wanted to welcome my colleague Daron Babcock up to the stage. Daron is the founder of a group called Bonton Farms in Dallas, and they've done deep neighborhood transformation work in Dallas that as we really think about what does it mean to go from that vision to the strategy that Doug was talking about, that Daron could help us think through more about the empowerment paradigm. So with that, let's welcome Daron.
Thank you.
Where was it? All right, so Daron, as we think about applying that empowerment paradigm in the city of Grand Rapids, when we think about believing in the city, the story of Bonton Farms, I think, is pretty relevant. So maybe start from the beginning. What is Bonton Farms and what's the story?
Well, maybe we start by what is Bonton, right? Mm-hmm. Bonton is a freedmen's community in Dallas, Texas. Dallas is a tale of two cities, so to speak, like a lot of our cities. The southern sector of Dallas is kind of the left behind. It's a bunch of neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. It's on the banks of the Trinity River, and so post-emancipation, black families had to find a place to live. They couldn't live where other communities were already established, and because it was on the banks of the river in a floodplain, they were able to establish community there. Before it was called Bonton, it was just a settlement. But the interesting thing I learned about that point in time is because we were precluded from going to the shops and the restaurants and the hospitals and all of that, it created this deep collaboration in our community where we had to build those things ourselves. And so economic prosperity rose rather quickly. And if you walk through our neighborhood with the people that have lived there for a long time, they'll show you on every corner where there used to be businesses flourishing owned by people from our community. And as they started to prosper, they would build homes closer to the existing neighborhoods where electricity and plumbing and running water was, and that was met with bombing. So before our community was known as Bonton, it was referred to as Bombtown. The response to that in Dallas was our mayor said, in order to prevent this violence from pervading our city, we're going to apply for new federal money to build public housing to keep them where they belong. It was overt language that was used in the newspaper at the time. So Bonton received 2 public housing developments. Our community bloomed from about 1,500 to 6,000 overnight. And what used to be, what the old timers from our neighborhood will say is, look, we have always been materially poor, but we have been rich in community. And when the public housing came down, the culture shifted. Instead of having this idea of collaboration and we have abundance when we work together, we became pitted against each other, kind of fighting over crumbs. And what used to be us having this deep collaboration turned into the fact that you can now lose your life by walking down the street with the wrong color on. And so that's a bit of the background. Bonton today, when I first got introduced to it 13 years ago, Bonton incarcerates more of our residents than any other zip code in the state of Texas. About half our men will go to prison before their 25th birthday. We haven't graduated more than 54% of our kids from high school in over 40 years. We have the second highest teen birth rate, highest infant mortality rate. We suffer from more than double the rate of cancer and stroke and heart disease and diabetes and childhood obesity than the county we're in. And men in our neighborhood will live about 11.7 years less than the average lifespan of a man in the county we're in. And so a friend of mine that was involved in prison ministry established a relationship inside the prison that carried out once the guy was paroled, and he happened to be from this neighborhood in Bonton. And if any of you have ever spent a lot of time in the inner city, we're not great at encouraging one another, but we're all human beings, and we all long to be believed and encouraged. And so when my friend showed up and started developing and continuing this relationship with his friend that had been paroled, it was fascinating how other people just started flocking to that house. And before long, he started asking other people, will you come down and help me? There's so many people showing up that they all have needs, they all have dreams, and they all need to be believed in. They're showing up because we're encouraging one another. And so when I went down that day and met those men, it flipped everything that I thought I knew on its head. And so I think what you were talking about is so apropos, because what happened in me was this paradigm shift that was almost forced on me, because everything I thought I knew was just exposed to being untrue. And so it started with this deep, I have to learn, like I have to understand more. And I just met, it was this amazing juxtaposition of that data, that really negative, bad data that I just shared with you, and these beautiful, resilient, capable people. It was like, how do those two things coexist? And so I had this crash course in what it means to believe in people. And that's the first thing that had to shift in me, is I had to start seeing, because it was more present than all of the negative stuff. What was visible to me is this is a beautiful group of people that have, for some reason, experienced all these incredible hardships. And I don't fully understand that. And so for 2 years, after about 6 months of volunteering, I was like, I can't develop the kind of depth of relationship to really understand this. This is so upside down from what I thought. And so I started asking my friends if they would ever consider letting me move there, just so I could build relationships. We had no plans to start an organization or do any work. I just needed to learn, and I wanted to be a true friend. And I don't know how to do that from a distance. And so after several weeks of them telling me, no, that'd be a bad idea, you wouldn't make it here, and all of that, eventually we continued the conversation. They said, yeah, if you'll come here, we want you, and we'll protect you. And when I say we, I want to put this in context. We was 6 men. Bonton's a community of 6,000 people. There were 6 people that said, we want you here, we'll vouch for you, and we'll look after you. And, I hope not to get emotional when I say this, but I will. What those 6 men went through, for me to have the opportunity to be present and learn. A lot of their families ostracized them. There were physical altercations. There had been gun pulled on them. And they stood their ground because they were that desperate and optimistic that there could be a better future for themselves and their kids. And so this journey started. Funny story, I think this is providential. When they agreed to allow me to move into the neighborhood, there was no place for me to live. One of the first things that I started learning about kind of top-down planning is everything in this neighborhood was designated as low income. So I'm not a social scientist or a city planner, but what do you think is going to happen when you build entire communities where the only people who can live there have no resources? By design. So I couldn't live there. The only way I got to move in was a family had defaulted on a Habitat house, and when they moved out, all of the rules or restrictions around low income fall away. And in our neighborhood at the time, if somebody moved out of a home, the guys know it, they come in and rip all the copper out, and once the home's open, it's converted into a trap house. So the CEO of Habitat called and said, hey, I heard the city told me you were looking to move into the neighborhood, and I have a house if you want to secure it, because we're trying to help the community, and this house of ours that we built is now being sold, drugs and prostitution are being sold out of it. So I moved into an active trap house.
Wow.
And it was fascinating because I had customers coming for the first 6 months I went there, and when I would answer the door, it was this fight or flight thing. But I got to meet some of the most amazing people in that real tense situation, that when they would run away or when they would start threatening and my friends would bring us together and we'd have a conversation, every single one of them who you would have thought might have been the hardest problems to deal with were all just longing for an opportunity. What can I plug into and be a part of?
So I wish we could tell the whole Bonton story, Daron, but maybe fast forward to today. What are the successes you've seen in the community, and what lessons have you learned about doing this deep neighborhood transformation work as a result?
Well, it's been about 13 years. Is Letitia here? Letitia, I've got to give you some credit. We were talking last night, and we were talking about progress, and I was like, well, progress happens at the pace of relationships. And she said, yes, and relationships advance at the pace of trust. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important to build that foundation, because that's the healthy foundation that everything else will be built on top of. And so our community started telling me what they dreamed and aspired to for themselves. And what we didn't understand is what were the barriers that were limiting them from experiencing that. And at the end of the day, it was this elongated journey of discovery, but it was really 7 things that I think now we call human essentials. They're essential to the human experience. In our society, they're essential. And it happened to be that all 7 of those were missing in our neighborhood. And so we started dreaming about what would it look like to build an ecosystem of these things that we haven't had before. And if they were present, could we leverage those into building lives that we aspired to? And so I'm happy to say that while the journey is not complete, and I don't think it ever will be, we're far enough along today to know that of the 54% high school graduation rate, we started a private school that now has over 100 children in it, and they're leading Dallas in terms of reading level and test scores. Without ever addressing crime, we've all just been building opportunity and institutions that help provide capabilities and opportunities for people. Over the last 6 years, property crime, violent crime, and murder rates dropped 61%. We're starting to see the return of that social cohesion, where instead of worrying about what street you can go down and what clothing you have on, what color you have, people are coming together over these third spaces where people are now gathering at the restaurant or the farm or the coffee house or any of the healthcare center, or the bank, and they're coming together, and when they pass each other, what used to happen in our neighborhood is 2 kids would get in a fight, and they'd go home and tell their families, and then it turns into the Hatfield-McCoys, and it blows up into this turf war where lots of people get hurt and some lose their lives. And now, because of these people are interacting in these third spaces and talking, it's like, I just talked with Miss Mary. We had lunch together today, and you better go down there and tell her you're sorry. And that was the way it used to be. And so it's really nice to see how when you create the right conditions, that kind of transformation can happen.
So I want to ask 2 more questions. I know we're running a little short on time. One, what have you seen? Because obviously what you're doing is working, and I mentioned those stats. Most of what we do in the social sector doesn't. So it's really inspiring when we first met to see what's working there. And now you're working with Stand Together to bring the principles and values. Daron is now on our team. He's handed the reins of Bonton Farms to local leadership, and is now working to apply these lessons to neighborhood transformation efforts across the country, including coming alongside the team at Thrive and Prosper and folks that are working on these issues here locally. What have you seen that has not worked when other people try to do this kind of work and fall into the traps of power and control? And then what have you seen that encourages you about what's happening here in Grand Rapids?
What doesn't work is we've already beat the drum on it. It's a lot of well-intended people come down, and it's the impact example you gave. Almost every plan I see is to end homelessness or cut childhood poverty by half or end poverty, or it's these grand umbrella things. And in order to do that, you have to create all of this force. And so somebody has to drive that from the top down. And I've never seen an example where that didn't do more. Not only did it not work, but it did more damage than before. So what I have seen work are these movements where people start to build relationships by coming in proximity with one another because they genuinely care. And through listening and applying the bottom-up paradigm where we believe the people closest to the problem have the best information about how to address it and what the solution might be, that in those conversations, there's an empowerment thing where, this may not make sense, but in Bonton, when we built our restaurant, we took it to city planning and they said, what are you going to do for security? I was like, what do you mean? Look, we'll have an alarm system. And they're like, what are you going to do for all the windows? You have a lot of windows. I was like, is this part of the normal review process? Like, you challenge the number of windows we have? Or like, well, it's just where you're building the building. And I went back and we talked to our community about it, and of course, we were all offended by that. We actually added more windows, and we decided as a community, look, this is what they think of us. So we have an opportunity to either prove them right or to prove them wrong. Let's create an opaque building filled with windows. We put this huge glass garage door in it and said, let's show them. And, I'm proud to say that over 13 years with all of our properties, nothing's ever happened to them because of the way it was done and the ownership that happens. There's other neighborhoods in proximation to us that maybe the city does a tax program and gets a grocery store to open because it's a food desert, and they close in 2 or 3 years because of all kinds of problems. But it was all because you can't do things to and for people in the same way that you can do things with and alongside people.
So, and I know we're out of time. I'm sure I'm getting the hook here soon. But if you could just bring it all together now, because you've been doing some work and our team's been on the ground alongside, Justin and the team at Thrive and Prosper, and just there's a lot that's really encouraging about what's happening here in Grand Rapids. What do you see that you're really inspired and encouraged by?
Well, just the team that's been built and the passion of Doug, I think, and his family to take this bold step to say, Grand Rapids is a great city. I go to a lot of cities across the country, and you guys are not at the level of desperation that many of our cities and the pressure and weight that many of our cities are under. And yet you're proactively saying, we care enough about this place, we're not going to wait till it gets to that point. We're going to do something about it, and the status quo is not getting us there. And I think that takes a tremendous amount of courage. And so I have great respect for all of you and the DeVos family and the Thrive and Prosper and Continuum team that work together to say we're going to take on the hard challenge, we're going to do it the right way. And I think I have great respect for the patience they're showing to do what's happening here today is to build the network and relationships and empower all of us to go out and play our unique role in the story, because that's the foundation that the real transformation will be built on.
Well, thank you, Daron. Well, look, it's such a privilege to be with you. I mean, I think if we think about applying the American idea today, flowing forward the ideas of the founders and the virtues they cared about, but more fully living up to them, where we, the people, can all come together and form a more perfect union. I can't think of any more important work that's happening anywhere in the country today than what you all are talking about and working on here together. And so whatever Daron or myself can do to come alongside you and help support you in that work, we're really thrilled and really grateful to be a part of what you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you.